Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Rahill, and I'll be your host for this podcast today. This is a new podcast we're trying out. Working title is Tell Me More. So much discipleship in following Jesus happens along the way, on the way to stuff. For me, it hasn't been a list of sermons that changed my life or a list of places I volunteered at or even specific books of the Bible, but it's the way that God has moved through people in and around all of those things, the conversations that happened because of those things. The journey has formed me much more than any particular destination. And so we're going to try to recreate that for you via this podcast. Hopefully this will be a place we get to talk about things that went into writing sermons and all the stuff we had to cut and why we think it's important, and some of the deeper biblical exegesis that goes into figuring some of these things out and discerning what God wants to say. We'll also talk about the whys behind some of the things we're doing and why are we doing this instead of this, and just explain kind of the passion and the heart behind our church. And hopefully we'll be able to have the conversations that happen behind the scenes here so that you can be a part of them too, and that just like I have, you'll get discipled along the way. So this is week 1, and we're going to start talking about the sermon from this past Easter 2 weeks ago. Alex Sr. is joining me today, and I'd like him to tell us a little bit more about what went into writing the Easter sermon. So my first question for you is, we talked about the proofs of Jesus's resurrection. Why was that important to talk about on Easter of all days? What made you choose that? Why was that important to you?
Hey, Alex, it's really good to see you. And I'm so glad you're here as you're with us, and excited about the opportunities this podcast will present for longer form discussions. So, one of the interesting things that I think should be mentioned, whether you're a Jesus follower or you're investigating the faith, is most of the New Testament actually is not about the proofs of the resurrection. It's about the implications of the resurrection for your life.
That's good.
And so you constantly see how, because the resurrection happened, people's lives were changed in these ways. However, in the 21st century, people stumble over, how can I even know this is true? And so I don't think you can get into the implications of the resurrection without giving a hearing of the evidence of the resurrection. And I would say this too, the church is often accused, and rightfully so in places, of not engaging with the same academic and intellectual rigor as the scientific world or the world of where thoughts and ideas and higher level academics and education are engaged. And that's, I think that can be true in some ways. It has been true of the church, but that's not true of the church. Actually, the church has led the way, in my mind, in science and art history. And so,
pause real quick there. Tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? What examples come to mind?
In terms of leading the way?
Yeah. How's the church led the way, in some of those things? Because I think that is a shocking statement to some people, and I think that's a cool insight. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, that would be another good podcast. So I would just so think about this. The ancient world would, if you threw out a baby, if someone didn't want a baby, that child ended up in one of 3 places. They ended up dead, so they'd just be thrown out. I didn't want a girl, I threw her out. They'd end up as a prostitute or in some form of sex slavery, trafficking, or they'd end up as a slave. Christians, realizing that people were made in the image of God, because this was all true, that they were made, that people were sacred. And so Christians started the first orphanages, the first hospitals. Look around your community. Where do you go to the hospital? I go to St. Joseph. I go to Mercy. You know, all the hospitals, our hospitals were started. Look at look at all of the almost all of the universities, if you across the world, started out of Christian, the Christian value of loving God. So if you go back to the great commandment, which is this: love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Healthy and holistic Christians see this as the whole person. So Christians were the ones who were trying to improve nutrition and feeding. Christians were the ones love God with all your mind, which was, let's do everything we can to develop this gift of intellect that God's given us. So if you go to universities, Harvard, Yale, Boston University, all these universities were started as Christian pursuit of intellectual advancement. So, so most people don't, really think about the church has actually been the leader. Music. If you think about some of the greatest music ever written, it was written by Christians as an expression of God is the ultimate, most beautiful, creative being. And so we give glory to God as we do this creative and life-giving pursuit of beautiful music or poetry.
Yeah, that's really good. So back to the resurrection then. Why were the proofs for the resurrection of value for you to talk about on Easter? What about Easter specifically? Because that struck me. I was like, I've never heard an Easter sermon that's about why the resurrection is real. I've always heard about what it means, exactly what you were saying. Most Easter sermons I've heard are about the implications of the resurrection, not the proofs for it. So yeah, tell me more about that.
Because I think that if someone's seriously seeking, they want to know that you've at least done some rudimentary logical process of evidence and examination. Yeah. So if you think about, and I want to tangent on science and faith at some point too, because we have this.
I'll write that down.
False dichotomy between science and faith, but good understanding of faith is a good understanding of logic and science. And so if you look at how historians establish historicity, what they do is it's called the inference of the best explanation. And we didn't get to go on this in the sermon, but I did a version of that, which is, why would a thinking person view this as have to wrestle with the resurrection as a historical fact, not as a religious belief, but as a historical fact? And a historian would want to examine the three indisputable truths that, whether people are secular or sacred in their thinking around this, they all agree on. The tomb was empty. There were eyewitnesses that were all over the first century world, hundreds of them, both skeptics or opponents, as well as people who loved Jesus. And then the church got established, and it shouldn't have happened, especially under Roman rule. You have to think about this.
Right.
Rome controlled everything. And so so I felt like if I were sitting there and I was going, I want to give Jesus a chance. Help me understand that there's a reason for me to believe this is true.
Right.
And then because otherwise I'm going to keep running into that roadblock, and I'm not going to really be able to receive the implications and applications if the resurrection is true.
Right. No, that's super, super good. That's really good. So in the sermon, you went through a couple different ways, some proofs for Jesus, and you just mentioned them, the establishment of the church, the witnesses. What were some things you had to cut or wish you could have talked about more?
Well, so this is more the history, and this is
actually, just to interrupt you real quick, if you don't know, if you're listening to this and you've never written a sermon, man, like 30 to 40 hours go into writing that 25 minutes or 30 minutes, often 30 minutes. Let's be real, we talk a little longer. And so there's so much that you have to do to get that, and then you have to just start mercilessly cutting stuff away you wish you could keep, which is part of why we want to do this podcast, is to give a space to talk about those things, because they're important and they're deep. But we only have a certain amount of time on Sunday morning. So sorry, continue. What were some of the things you had to cut, you really wish you could have kept in or talked more about?
Okay, so one of the beauties, and I think one of God's great gambles, you think God doesn't gamble, but yeah, so, just like God is pro-choice, he really is for people's free will, and he wants them to have choices. Please don't write us about that.
Yeah, it's not an abortion comment, it's a free will.
It's not about abortion. But I will say this. So let me say the first thing. You should be attracted to the Christian faith if for no other reason than it's the only religion that's vulnerable. So I think, and God did this, I think, on purpose. So what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, I can read it again at some point, is if the resurrection didn't happen, Christians are to be the most pitied, because there is no faith here. There's nothing worth living for if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So God staked everything on the resurrection. The whole Christian faith is vulnerable because it's built on the resurrection. And let me just mention this. So if you get into Buddhism and Hinduism, they're otherworldly. They're about states of consciousness and spirituality. They don't invite you to test them, so to speak. They're just, but they're talking about the fact that there's this spiritual world. And most people would say, yeah, there is something like that. Then you got Judaism and Islam, and they're text-based, they're law-based. They go, here's our book, follow the book, you'll have a good life. They don't invite you to test them either. They're pretty invulnerable. Yeah. The beauty of Christianity is it is absolutely spiritual and otherworldly. And it's based in these gifts of a word from God, we would say, that gives us instructions for how to live life. But the fulcrum of this whole thing that it sits on is the resurrection. And it invites you to examine it and be curious about it and test it. And so to me, I think it's one of the attractive things that Jesus was so confident in what was going on that he let the resurrection be this vulnerable diamond, so to speak, that any person could, with who is honest and curious. So even if someone says, I don't believe in this, I would invite you to be honest and curious about why did people start believing in this? We get into dogma, and we get into I'm thinking of another word here, but it's like marketing. What's
branding or
more? Keep going. Yeah, just what is it called when the party line? When politics. Yeah, but beyond that, you're drinking the Kool-Aid of the ideology. Okay. Anyway, we get into all the ideology stuff where we're trying to defend or knock down another position, rather than going, hey, what if I just was truly intellectually honest and I just said, I'm going to approach this and I just want to see what the evidence says. And Christianity invites that. That's why Paul, now think about the Apostle Paul. We could have did a whole thing on him. Here's this guy. He is a prominent figure in the ancient Near East. He is intelligent. He's been discipled by one of the greatest leaders of that time. He has prominence. He has everything to lose by going over to the Christian faith. And he's got money and he's got respect. And yet this guy who is a fierce opponent ends up on the other side. And he writes 1 Corinthians 15, which says, hey, your whole life is based on this one event. And I know it firsthand because I met the resurrected Jesus. And anyway.
Do you want me to pull that up? I can show that on the screen here.
Sure. Yeah, let's. 15. 1 Corinthians 15. So this is what we base the message off of. And I'll read it to you for a minute. It says, now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. So we have something to hold on to if we're believers. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. That means you believe for nothing. So for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. That word receive means he received the actual testimony. It's it's part of oral tradition. We're used to texts, like having a text and a computer. almost all of the history of the ancient world was kept through oral traditions, stories passed down over time. And so for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Now, that's one element we didn't get into. I would just that the evidence of the prophecies of Scripture. There's hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus, and even if you were to whittle them all down, you would have there's at least 60 prophecies that you would have to say, I don't know how to explain this. This is like pointing to this messianic figure who could only who would be born in Israel, in Bethlehem, would be called a Nazarene. He would be pierced for his hands and feet would be pierced. Psalm 22, I'll just say this about Psalm 22. Right. This is before crucifixion's even a thing.
Right.
So why would anybody pierce their hands and feet when that wasn't a means of execution? And how could you know the Romans would use that? This is hundreds of years before. Right. Anyway, so the scriptures, so Paul says this twice. He died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried, and then he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And then let's go down to verse 8. It says, and last of all, he appeared to me as one abnormally born, for I am the least of the apostles and do not deserve to be called an apostle because I was persecuted. I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace was not without effect. Paul just said, I work harder than anyone. And then, so if we go down to verse 19, we'll do 16 and 19. So it says, for if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, so if there's no resurrection, your faith is futile. That means it's wasted, it's ineffective, and you are still in your sins. We won't get into the atonement aspect of this. Then those who also have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. We're going to come back to that. You know YOLO? I remember this YOLO, you only live once. You can ask me about this later, but it's really YOLT, like jolt. You only live twice. And so that's one of the implications here of the resurrection is they didn't talk about people dying. They fell asleep in Christ because they were going to live again. And if only for this life, now look at verse 19, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be shoot. So Paul now, if you want to do a little more work and you're watching us, read 1 Corinthians 15. It's one of the most dense, packed, if you want to understand the implications of the resurrection and all the good things that God has for you, 1 Corinthians 15 is a tight form summary of all the good gifts God has for us. And Paul basically says this, if the resurrection didn't happen, Christian faith is useless. And this is a guy who was an enemy, who converted because of he encountered the risen Christ, and he died for that belief in the end. So you can pull that off, but that was so. Whenever someone says that, I mean, there you go. There's the vulnerability of the Christian faith. Can I give you one more thing? Another thing separate from that now?
Yeah.
So one other piece that I wish we could have talked about, but hey, we get to talk about here now.
I know, it's great. This is great.
Is this, and I might try to find this quote by N.T. Wright, who's a scholar who I love. One of the things we don't understand in the 21st century is resurrection wasn't a thing in the first century. It was unwelcome. So it was unwanted. It was actually illegitimate. And let me just give you some short form, and if you want to ask a question, you can. But so for the Greeks, you have Plato's forms, right? So Plato was one of the greatest thinkers, the cave. So he said, this world is we see the shadows. but in the afterlife, we see the pure form. Okay, that's where we get Gnosticism from, right? Which is this idea that this world physicality is degraded, and only when we graduate to true spirituality will we experience the purity of life. And so.
Spiritual's good, physical's bad.
Now think about this.
Right.
Spiritual's good, physical's bad. So resurrection is like heresy to that thinking.
It's totally.
Not neutral. It's unwelcome. It violates that whole philosophy. Okay. Right. So the Greeks do not want this. In fact, I can't remember which story it is. Is it? It might have been Apollo. For some reason, I think I'm wrong here. But Zeus thunderbolts one of his kids.
You're right. You're right. No, totally. Yeah, I know this.
Because he tries to bring a big kid back to life.
Right.
And he gets the thunderbolt.
Right.
Which is like, don't do this. This kid's. And I can't remember which story it is, but that's a good little encapsulation. So the Greeks and Romans. No, it wasn't neutral. It's like, no, we don't, resurrection is degraded. We're not looking forward to anything like coming back to life.
Right.
Do you understand? Right. So we don't see that today, but we have to put ourselves in the world, the first century, right? Which is not true. God made us physical, which is one of the reasons we don't like the idea of heaven. Most Christians think heaven sounds boring. It's because they don't understand it. We go, this life is rich, and if it was rich in all its fullness, where I experience love, joy, peace, and I could move in the physicality. This is why we want to play with virtual reality, by the way. We want a better world where we can, we want to incarnate it. It's right. So the resurrection is the completion of the cycle. When we die and there's an intermediate state, we won't get into that. But it's one of the reasons Christians don't want heaven or don't like it, because they don't understand it. So pause that. So the Greeks don't want it. Let me just say that the Jews didn't have it either. What the Jews had was, we believe at the end of the age, God will corporately raise the Jewish nation.
Right.
And then people will experience some life or death without him.
Right.
There was a corporate accounting and presence with God at the end of the age. There was nothing like we understand here. Now, let me just point this out, which this is what makes the New Testament so cool and why people need to read Gospels. So when Mary says in John 20, they've taken the Lord, you're like, how can they be so dumb? This is the world they lived in. Right. So when Jesus said, the Son of Man, me, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again, and they didn't understand it, we go, they're so stupid. They weren't stupid. They actually did not have a schema, container for understanding that. Now, it was there throughout the Old Testament, but this played out in a way differently. Again, God surprises us in that way. But it's one of the reasons why the disciples were slow to believe, because they weren't anticipating this either, which lends more credence to the authenticity of the writings. So it was unwelcome. So as Christianity was vulnerable, I think that's important to understand. And it was unwelcome. So then you have to say, well, why did people start believing this stuff?
Right.
Which when you put it in that setting, you go, well, some things must have happened. Right. And here's another thing, and let me just say this, because this is a really important piece when we look back at ancient documents. We have chronological arrogance. And that's an important thing to recognize. We think we're smarter than people were 100 years ago or 500 years ago. Right. Or we think people 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago were less intelligent than us. And I think that's a major, that creates it keeps us from getting to the truth. Right. Because people were just as smart or smarter when you consider oral tradition. You're like, yeah, but we've made all these gains. Well, why do we make all these gains? I'll go back to the church and the Christian faith. because loving God with your mind became a thing. And so how do we continue to grow and develop as people? But we have this, we think we're smarter than people were 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And, if you had a time capsule, it's one of those things that I'd love to put a smart person today to debate Thomas Aquinas or the Apostle Paul.
Right.
And just
man.
Oh, I always thought you were dumb, but no, you weren't. Or, again, Plato, we give some credence to, or Socrates. But anyway, people were just as smart. And, but when we think we're smarter, we disregard key evidence. Because we think, they're just a bunch of backwater hicks kind of people. They believe in all this stuff. They didn't believe in all this kind of stuff.
Right.
It's why the disciples said, who stole the body first?
Right.
Because they weren't sure. So anyway.
Right. So that brings up, there's a lot of theories from atheists or agnostics about the resurrection not being real, not because there wasn't a body, but because Jesus must not have really died. Right. There's tons of proofs about this arguments, tons of arguments about this. So how do we know Jesus was really dead, and why does that matter? Because if, I can just see somebody gaining from this conversation, looking into a little more, and immediately coming up against all these different people, like the swoon theory, and all these different arguments against the resurrection that don't deny the body was missing, but do deny, well, there can't be a resurrection if there wasn't a death. You can't come back to life if you never lost your life. So tell me a little bit more about that, because we didn't get into that in the sermon.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. So, and so let's go back to the three facts everybody agrees on, because it sets up why that is a thing. So the tomb was empty. Everybody agrees to that. We didn't lose the tomb. Jesus was a problem. They were going to kill, wanted him out of the way. They wanted to solve the problem. And Jesus was a problem because the Jews were a problem and they didn't want an insurrection.
Right.
Okay. So.
Right. That's why Pilate went along with it, even though he wasn't for it all the way. Right.
Exactly. Right. Totally. Because the Jews were a problem anyway. And we see how that ended. They, unfortunately, they got crushed. But the tomb was empty. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses, and many of those were opponents initially. So you have to take that into account. There were people who had they didn't want Jesus to be resurrected. Right. They didn't believe in him when he was alive. So that's the second piece. And the third piece is the establishment of the church. And we have to, again, goes back to this mindset. If you and I, something happened, there was an X factor that the church should have never started, especially under Roman rule.
Right.
So we think about Hitler, we think about some of the most crushing regimes, Mao, you think about all these, think about a small little movement that's going to be based on a lie and knowing they're going to get crushed by the powers that be. It's just the stupidest thing on earth. Nobody's going to sign up to go, just kill me, right? Not for a reason. So going back to what you asked, the reason why the swoon theory became a thing was because historians had those three facts were agreed on. Tomb's empty. Eyewitnesses saw stuff. The church happened. Maybe Jesus actually didn't die. Maybe he was on the cross. He swooned. He passed out to the point where they thought he was dead. They put him in the tomb. He woke up and said, "Oh, I'm glad that didn't happen." And he crawled out. Right? Yeah. So what do you want to know about that?
So why does that not make sense?
So
because we would disagree with that. And I think there are really good reasons for disagreeing with that. But at first, especially if you're biased in that way, if you are not a follower of Jesus, or maybe you're just skeptical or cynical and are biased against the idea of the resurrection, this is appealing at first because it seems like, people have near-death experiences all the time. There's people all the time throughout America who like, I was dead for 20 minutes, or I was dead for, 3 hours and I came back to life, and that would be, so this idea that, oh, maybe that happened to Jesus, maybe that was how it worked, is at first appealing. But I think for me, especially when I was in high school, I started to wonder these things and look into it. It immediately became like, oh, that doesn't make sense. And so tell me more about that. Tell me why that theory hasn't gained a lot of steam. I mean, it's never died, but it's never been widespread either in any kind of meaningful way. So
no, that's great. And again, back to be intellectually honest, be curious. These are the questions you should ask, right? Are people are going to go, well, what about, and this is why historicity is about examining all the evidence and then saying, we have, this is our best inference based on all the evidence. And so, people can say, well, I don't agree. I go, okay, but if you look at all the evidence, it's Occam's razor, right? And we should look that up to say it correctly. But basically, when everything that is not true has been eliminated, what remains has to be accepted as the truth.
Yeah, the Occam's razor says it's the problem-solving principle, and Occam, by the way, folks, is spelled O-C-C-A-M.
Yeah.
Or O-C-K or O-C-H. It's spelled multiple ways, but it's the problem-solving principle that says entities should not be multiplied without necessity. Or more simply, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. That's Occam's razor.
So for the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Now, the point is, this gets into worldview, because if you say, oh, there could be a supernatural power, well, then the simplest, if you go, you know what, I think there could be a power, a force outside of us, and you go,
hence agnostics. Hence why people go like, the universe has done it. The universe has made this happen. Right.
And so if you said, but if you go, I cannot entertain that, which again is a bias, right?
Right.
Then you have to look for all these other things. But if you go, okay, if there's a supernatural power in this universe, and Jesus was conspiring with this power in some way, this power was available, then, that makes the empty tomb, all these things all of a sudden go, oh, because he was dead and he rose from the dead. Mm-hmm. But that's a big leap. So let's go back to the swoon theory.
Right. So why was it basically a historical certainty that he did die?
Yeah. So I'm watching The Mandalorian right now.
So good. What episode are you on? Quick tangent.
I'm trying to remember.
What's the latest thing that happened?
Season 2. Let's see what just happened. Baby Yoda just got stolen, but it's not really Baby Yoda. It's Grogu or whatever.
Yeah.
A descendant maybe of Yoda.
Something we don't know yet.
We don't know. And then Darth Vader's great-great-grandson, or I don't know who Moff Gideon is. He just stole the baby again.
Right.
He's the donor. So anyway, but like if you look at, sorry,
I got you sidetracked.
I know.
So we're talking about the swoon theory. We're talking about why Jesus definitely died, the Mandalorian.
It's like the Mandalorian. So if the Mandalorians are going to kill somebody and they say they're dead, they're dead. Okay? And so I was trying to think about who are the most elite fighting corps.
Sure.
And when they're given an assignment, they get it done. The Romans were experts at taking over nations, creating Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, and eliminating opposition. Their army was second to none. They knew how to kill people. Mm-hmm. Okay? So again, we can think, well, maybe they didn't do it right. Come on, there's a reason why they're the ruling power in the world.
Right. And they've taken over everything.
Yeah. And here's the thing. Before Pilate, so you have remember, Jesus is up all night on trial. They're beating him all night long.
Right.
Okay? There's no water. There's no drinks. You're getting dehydrated. Remember, you're in Israel. You're in a desert-like climate. You have no water. And then the Romans, in an effort to appease the Jews, do their torture.
Right.
So they torture him and 39 lashes,
thorns. Right.
cat of nine tails. If you saw one of these whips and what one swipe with this whip will do, you might find that picture. This could be like Joe Rogan with Jamie. Hey, Jamie, find that picture of that whip.
Jamie. Hey, Jamie, can you pull up a...
It's got steel and glass in it, and it's a cat of nine tails. So they whip it, and they're experts at this, and then they rake it across your back so it just plows up your skin like furrows. Oh. And it goes, and it'll wrap all the way around, so it'll get your ribs. So he's shredded. He's literally shredded. They're beating his face. They're punching his head. These guys are experts at torture, and yet they keep him alive. Right?
Right. Yeah, they do. That's a good point. They know how to. So here's some pictures of it. You can see the metal pieces.
Yeah. I mean, it's wicked. And they were experts at how to remember. They knew how to kill, but even more, they knew how to incite fear because of so much pain that they could create somebody up to the point of death. So they wanted Jesus to be a lesson. So they're beating him and beating the snot out of him. So what was Jesus as an adult? He's a carpenter, right? That's our understanding. Who's he hanging out with? Fishermen. These guys are tradesmen. I don't know. I have some friends who work in the trades, carpentry and everything. You see their gnarled hands, their forearms that look like Popeye. Why? Because they lift and work. They work hard all day.
Right.
So now think about this. That's who Jesus was.
Right.
These other two guys are carrying their cross. What happens when Jesus carries his cross?
Right. He can't do it. He falls down.
He can't do it. He's so close to death. Wow. Even as he's getting toward the cross.
Yeah.
See, he's almost dead. He had all this punishment for hours and hours and hours by expert torturers. And he's bleeding out all over the place. So think about the blood loss. Think about how dizzy you get when you lose that much blood.
Yeah.
In fact, Isaiah 53 said he was marred beyond recognition. Like you couldn't even recognize his face anymore. He just was so badly beaten, and his body. So here's this super strong guy in his 30s who is a tradesman. Yeah. He can't carry his cross anymore. They have to get someone to do it because he's so close to death.
Right. So we have the Romans are professional killers. They knew how to bring Jesus to the brink of death before the crucifixion, and they know how to kill him and make sure he's dead at the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Let's just say, for the sake of the swoon theory argument, they screwed up, right? So tell me a little bit more about the burial process and like the bandaging and stuff.
Yeah.
And why, even if he had survived the cross, how he would not have survived the tomb. Tell me a little bit more.
Can you hold that for 1 second? I just have to give you one more fun, not fun, but interesting tidbit.
One more fun fact about killing people.
Not a fun fact, but a important fact.
Yeah. Okay.
Because remember, John was there.
Right. That's true.
And so you have the synoptic gospels. And again, I want to encourage you, a lot of people never read the gospels and they make decisions about Jesus.
Right. That's true.
And, if I never read a book on physics and I said, well, I think physics is stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, you're like, that's ignorant.
Yeah.
So, just again, to be intellectually honest, we should at least engage some of the texts that would say these are defining texts. So read the gospels. It wouldn't take you real long. So John wants us to be, he brings in some facts that are really important. And remember, all the disciples died for their faith. But it says, so Jesus said it is finished on the cross. This is John 19, and you can bring this up if you want. Alex.
Sure, I will.
Now, the Jews asked that they kill Jesus and the other prisoners before the Sabbath. So, because the Sabbath was sacred to the Jews. Remember, they're trying to keep the Jews happy. So they want to kill all the prisoners by sundown. So one of the things they would do is they'd break their legs if they were still alive. Okay? So go to 19. This is why this section is such an interesting section. Verse 31, because they did not want the, now it was the day of preparation. The next day was to be a special Sabbath, right? It was the Passover, okay? So this is a big deal. The Passover is a big deal.
Right.
Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross, verse 31. Mm-hmm. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken. So here's the thing. This is the crazy sick thing about crucifixion. You're hanging from your hands, so there's spikes through your hands or under your hands, the wrist, and there's spikes through your feet, and you have a little bit of a thing on the bottom. And so it's actually the way you die is suffocation.
Yeah.
So you push yourself up, it hurts your feet so bad you're dying, but you get in there, and then you slink back down, and then you start losing air again, and now it's pulling on your hands, right?
Right.
So they would break the legs so they could no longer push up and get another breath. And they would die within minutes, right?
Yikes.
So, but one of the prophecies of Jesus.
That's intense.
It is intense. And this is, we just don't respect the Romans. We don't respect history enough. Yeah. They were experts at torture and execution. Yeah. So imagine you watching that.
Right.
One of the lessons is, I don't want to be that guy, right? Mm-hmm. So, so the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus. Now Jesus had already said it is finished. So he did what he needed. He said it's finished, and he breathed his last. It said just a little earlier than that. Okay. So, but when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead and did not break his legs. One of the prophecies of Jesus was that not a single bone would be broken. Because the Passover lamb, Jesus was the substitute for, the bones weren't broken. Okay. So they didn't break his legs. Instead, now really this is very important, and it's absolute medical science of that time. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear up into his heart. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. He went up through the rib cage, pierced his heart.
Yeah, right.
Okay, bringing a sudden flow of, what does that say? Can you see that? What is it? Verse 34, the end of 34.
And this is John 19 still?
Yeah. Bringing a sudden.
One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side of spear, sudden flow of blood and water. Right.
Okay, now this is and so listen to what it says. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. So John's saying, I saw this. I was there.
Right.
So think about oil and vinegar. This is the best illustration I can give. You know, if you ever have a salad and you have oil and vinegar, you shake them up. But as soon as they stop moving, what happens with the oil and vinegar?
They separate.
It separates. Your blood and my blood, the second our heart stops pumping, the blood starts to separate. And there's this kind of watery serum that happens. So just like oil and vinegar, this happens. And if someone's dead, that their heart, which again, your main pump, stops, and it begins now to separate.
Yikes.
So one of the signs that someone's dead, like if I punctured your heart right now, I wouldn't do it, but we just see blood.
Yeah.
But if you had been dead for let's say, I don't know, I think it's 10 minutes, whatever it is, 15 minutes.
The appropriate amount of time.
It would have separated.
Yeah.
So it would look like blood and water flowed.
Right.
So that's actually one of the proofs. And think about it. Where did he the only place, and the blood and the water aren't coming from your lungs. They're coming from your heart. So the spear goes up through the side. He punctures his heart. Blood and water come out, proving death. But he just punctured his heart too.
Right.
So that's why Jesus says to doubting Thomas, hey, put your finger in my hand. And I'll take your hand and I want you to put it in the spear slot in my side. You want to tickle my heart?
Right.
Okay. No.
Oh,
That's
oh,
gross.
wow.
Sorry. It reminds me of Mortal
Grabbing
Kombat.
Jesus by the heart. Mortal Kombat. Finish him.
When I was, anyway, they would rip his heart out.
That's a different picture for what happened between
sorry,
Jesus
I
and
shouldn't have
Thomas.
gone there.
Just a
That
Mortal
was probably-
Kombat moment.
So, okay. Now, so I think that's all prequel. Okay.
Right.
So he's dead.
Right. So,
Now,
so the
go
swoon
ahead.
theory is saying he's not dead
Yep.
at that point.
Yep.
And which already starts to feel like, okay, well, this is not holding much water, no pun intended. So the crucifixion itself is proof number one, but then so is the burial process, right?
Yeah.
Proof number two as to why the swoon theory has not gained widespread intellectual popularity is because of
What happens next?
the burial process, right? So tell me more about that.
So, how many of you have duct tape? So there was duct tape in the first century. It was called a burial cloth. So seriously, if you see this process, you go, there's no way. I don't care how healthy you are.
You're like, it's like 70 pounds of like
Yes,
cloth and
so
spices.
Again, I always tell people when I'm explaining this, think of a mummy. You know, they're wrapped in those cloths. So what they do is they get strips. It's 70 pounds. And they're putting strips of linen. So think of strips, and they're wrapping you in this, think like a mummy.
Mm-hmm.
But they're putting on spices and oils and liquids.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what happens is that's all going to harden.
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting wrapped up like this. And that is so that the body, when it decays, doesn't stink and everything. It's kind of a sweet smelling incense. So it's kind of like, I hate to say it, but a version of embalming. So the body's not going to stink. They would put bodies in tombs, which were family burial sites. And the tombs, again, to prevent robbers and other things, had big, big doors, and I'll talk about that. So they're wrapping Jesus up from the feet all the way to the head in these strips of linen with spices and oils, and then it's drying. So think about like
a
syrup.
cast.
Think about syrup, right? Or something, right? And strips of cloth, and someone's putting syrup on you in strips of cloth. It's a version of duct tape. Okay. And it's sealing the body. Mm-hmm. So now imagine this. You're like, you've got the snot beat out of you. You bled like unbelievable. Right. Oh, by the way, let's say they didn't pierce your heart.
Right.
They
You're
just
so
put a huge
close to
hole
death,
in your body.
They think you're dead.
Yeah. Like, you're leaking tire. Your body's leaking fluid like a tire that just ran over a railroad spike. I mean, you know, you're not surviving, but let's just say you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. So you are not getting out. Right. It's like being buried alive. So, so you're in this cocoon. It's a cocoon that someone lovingly wrapped you in. You're put on top of this table, this bed, this rock bed. Now, here's the other piece. There's this massive stone. It looks like it could be 5 or 6 feet high. It takes 3 or 4 strong, full-size adults, men usually, to move this thing. Mm-hmm. So think about this. You woke up, you're like, oh my gosh, you can't get out of this thing. You know? Right. I'm going to headbutt the door. You know. Right. It's not so happening. You got to get out of all these linens.
Right. 70 pounds of it in
70
a weakened
pounds.
State, dehydrated, beat to where people think you're dead.
And think of it again like syrup. So just imagine your body being wrapped in syrup for more than an hour. Yeah. Okay? So then you're going to get out of all this stuff somehow because you have all that much strength. And then you've got to move this stone that weighs 2 tons. Right. So think about your car. Yeah. Think about, I'm trying to think which car weighs 2 tons without wheels on it. Yeah. You're like, oh, I don't know. So I'm just saying the stone is so big and heavy. And then there's guards in front of that. Right. So this is where it starts to get ludicrous. You're going,
Right.
even if Jesus swooned,
Right.
he never would have got out of the wrappings.
Right.
Someone moved a stone.
Right.
And now let me just say this. This is pretty cool too. Let's see. Is it Mark or is it John? Hold on for 1 second. I should have looked this up earlier, but anyway, John goes in, and so think about that image of the cocoon I just gave you.
Yeah.
John goes in, and imagine those wrappings still exactly where they were.
Mm-hmm.
No body.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The wrappings are still there, and there's no body.
Right. That's crazy.
And that's when it says this disciple saw and believed.
Right.
The first one to go, oh my gosh.
Right.
I finally connected the dots. We didn't believe he was going to be raised on the third day because it just wasn't part of our thinking, our schema.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And but the chrysalis, it was like a chrysalis that was empty.
Right. Right. And the
here's
guards,
this empty chrysalis still intact. The wrappings are all there.
Right.
And again, the stone is rolled away.
Yep.
The guards don't know what happened.
Right.
And then there's angels. There's a messenger.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So hence why people really do think, Jesus was dead, and why it's, in the first century, the swoon theory was not popular. It was somebody stole the body theory.
Somebody stole the body. That's
so much more likely.
Yes.
But then obviously all the eyewitnesses make that difficult to believe.
Yeah. And remember, nobody wanted nobody saw this coming.
Right.
Right.
So, this all goes back to the first part of our conversation.
And then if you're making up a lie, you have to put yourself back, and you have to actually put yourself in that group, the 500 people and the many who died for their faith, back in their position where it's like they didn't even think of resurrection. Why steal the body?
Right.
No reason to do it. If the body was, and everybody wanted Jesus dead,
mm-hmm.
that was part of the there's no motive.
Right.
And if you knew and you had stolen the body, you were that person. You overcame the guards. You drugged them somehow. Who knows? And you moved the stone. You were able to pull Jesus' naked body out.
Right.
But leave the wrappings all there.
Convince 500 eyewitnesses that he was alive and the real guy.
Yeah. So let me just say this last piece about swoon, because I'm glad you just said that. If you saw Jesus, and let's say he didn't die.
Yeah.
And you were a follower of his, he's going to look like death warmed over. You're seeing him within, a few days of this, 3 days. You're going to feel sorry for him. You're going to want to get him a doctor, but you're not going to think he's the resurrected king of the world.
Right.
So just think, you're not going to convince people that you're their answer.
Right.
People are going to feel pity for you, not go, they're not going to fall down on their knees and worship you.
Our movement worked. You're here.
Yeah.
Right. So let me ask you this last question as we close. How has this idea of the proofs of the resurrection impacted your faith, your walk with Jesus? What change has this made for you personally?
Well, again, if it's not true, you're wasting your time.
Mm-hmm.
If it is true, it means everything he said is true.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's 3 or 4 things for me that really matter, which means so you go, I'm not sure if I believe the Bible. I'm not sure either. I wasn't as a young person, right? People go, oh, but if Jesus is the king and he calls the scriptures, the word of the Lord, I accept that based on who Jesus is. Now, I still investigate the veracity of the scriptures, but suddenly the message is true.
Right.
Which means all the instructions are true. Love God. What does that mean? Love people, right? So to me, that the message is true. 2 is for me, it's about how do I live my life? So here's the thing. The truth is this. Let's say the world we all want is the world Jesus came to usher in his kingdom.
Right.
That there's this love that is this unconditional love from God that you can have for others. Think about all the problems in the world, and what if people just said, I'm going to put other people ahead of myself and love them? Our world is broken because of sin, but love is real. Joy is available. God, we want joy. God gave us joy. I want that joy. Goodness is real. That when we see good things, we want the world to be a better place for a reason. You're made in the image of God, and that's what I understand now. This deep longing in my heart is actually the fulfillment. The resurrection activates this thing that in my heart that I sense is true. I want to be true, and that animates what it means to be made in the image of God, which is I want to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. Right. It means forgiveness is possible. Guess what? We are all broken. We've all screwed up. And if we were to tell each other our stories, we'd feel bad for each other. And if we were to admit it, we failed. Forgiveness is possible. And so for me, the message is true. Life is available in Jesus. Forgiveness is available. And so I try to live according to that. And it means this, I'm going to live twice. So I want to help other people. It says, one of the Lord's Prayer is this, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. We want God's name to be lifted up on this world, because only when we're rightly aligned with God do we rightly align with the rest of the world. That's how the world works. And so we love God, we love others. Your kingdom come. You see, Jesus is a king. And he's a resurrected king, which means this, Jesus is alive today.
Right.
He's a resurrected king today. And we have this intermediate time right here, right? Between the resurrection and when Jesus will come again. And I believe he's going to come again. And I want to live as though that reality is there. And that we're trying to help other people know and understand his love and his forgiveness and his truth and his purpose. Because here's the deal. This is why I wanted to do this for Comeback Stories. That's our series we're doing right now, and the resurrection fits into this. And let me just say this, and this was another thing I couldn't say, but this is absolutely so relevant to your life. There's only 4 main characters in a story. All stories have 4 characters, basically. There's a hero. There is a guide. There is a villain. And there is a victim. Okay? Jesus came as the hero of our story so that we